I'm back, part three, and hopefully the concluding part of the lecture on both Feste and Malvolio when juxtaposed to one another. So I concluded kind of the last lecture on the two by drawing attention to the fact that they both seem to, if not be astute regarding Cesario's flip-floppiness and regarding the power language wheels to corrupt but also to manipulate the environment. I want now to draw on how the two are different despite sharing this similar wisdom, right, or similar understanding of the world as they encounter it. For Feste, this world-wise finding about the human condition and about social operations it's an inclusive finding in that he participates as a citizen who is vulnerable to this himself, right? He recognizes himself in the fallibility that he identifies. And that is what makes him less bitter of a foolish pill or of a clownish pill to swallow. He is capable of finding not joy, but pleasure, and of finding resourcefulness within these fallible moments that he identifies as the human condition, right? And he, I won't say seeks to forgive this fallibility. No, I don't think he is. He's that kind of a fool or clown. We're going to see something like that manifest itself in Lear. Instead, he has a whole, well, let's move on with this kind of spirit, right? Like there is a nonchalance that is associated with his recognition of the corruptible nature of human beings within society. He also says, well, let's make the most of it, right? I mean, so it's not forgiving. It is an acknowledgement, and it is also a pointing to the ways in which this lends itself to appropriation, right? This reality of the human condition lends itself to appropriation by enabling the likes of Cesario and also Feste, but also Maria, also Sebastian, also Cesario. Did I mention Cesario already? He acknowledges the fact that all these citizens of Illyria and elsewhere have the capacity to appropriate the highly fallible situations within which they find themselves, highly fallible environments. And by fallible, I mean, these environments and situations are less than ideal for the individuals, or for all of the individuals, right? Perhaps Orsino and Olivia come the closest to having an ideal situation in that they can perform, affectively construct their emotions as they would like to have displayed, while not necessarily participating in the citizenry and the social and material mechanisms that go into, say, stitching together the affect, right? The emotion that they're performing. So they have as close to an ideal situation as is possible because they can act without literally experiencing the life that they live in the imagination or live in isolation. But other than that, the other characters that we see in the play have less than ideal situations. Even someone like a real fool like Agichik, right, whose money, as one of you very astutely noted, like Rodrigo's situation in Othello, is being milked from him, right? It is being steadily pilfered by a smooth operator. Only Toby is not anywhere close to being as smooth in his operations as Iago is, right? So even Agichik's situation is less than ideal in that he desires a position and a future for himself that seems to be nowhere near happening. Maria can emulate her mistress because of her proximity to her, and yet must hear from her mistress that Malvolio is an extremely valuable person to Olivia, right? And that she won't tolerate Malvolio's mistreatment, or that she wants him cared for, right? So Maria, who seems to be the big boss of the domestic sphere, also understands that perhaps her situation is vulnerable if Malvolio were to say out her as a wrongdoer, right? So in short, none of these characters, other than Olivia and Orsino, have an ideal picture. And what Feste recognizes is that this less than ideal environment that they all must inhabit can enable them to appropriate the situations, right? Appropriate language, appropriate the opportunities that they find in order to better themselves and in order to better, perhaps, the overall situation. He puts himself in that club or crew of characters. He is part of that world that he is very aware of, right, and is able to read closely. And this is the biggest difference between him and Malvolio. Malvolio, too, is an astute observer of the world around him, right? It's all a matter of fortune, just luck, right? Who's born as what, and how their lives are transformed as a result of that, right? And he understands that the fate that he's been dished out might not necessarily be, well, he understands it's definitely not ideal for him. He wants a different world, but he also understands that he can change this for himself, right? However, he does work with the assumption that he is exceptional, right? He is different to the world that he inhabits. He's different from, say, the other characters, the Festes, for crying out loud. He is not like them. He is special, right? And therefore, in his appropriation, he believes he is righting or correcting the world by bringing it to what it should have looked like in the first place, right? So by aspiring toward his identity as Count, by aspiring toward a marriage to Olivia that would make him wealthy and have like a gold watch, and a velvet robe, by articulating these aspirations, he shares with us his fantasy of seeing himself as he should be, but also seeing himself in the world where nothing else has changed, right? The world does not transform into being better for everybody, but it is a better world specifically because he now operates in a different realm of power, right? So this is the key difference. Even as they both have the ability to judge Cesario and Cesario's character, Malvolio is not able to pinpoint the matter, because for Malvolio, the world is meant to be seen only from his central position, right? He really is a solipsistic character in that regard. Whereas Feste is always on the peripheries, right? He literally is living in these outskirty places. I mean, he lives by the church, we hear, right? He walks in and out of households like Olivia's, like Orsino's. He seems not really bound in the sense that I mentioned in the first of these lectures, that Malvolio is, right? And I think that's the reason Malvolio's solipsism is so renders him so tightly wound up, right, and incapable of seeing himself as fallible, right? His solipsism does not allow him to think of himself alongside Cesario, alongside Feste, alongside Maria. He must see himself differently, and that's what he shows to the world, right? I mean, he reveals his vulnerability because of his solipsism, because of his inability to recognize that appropriation is just about everybody's game, because there is so much fallibility within the social environment that they must all collaborate or participate in tweaking and shifting their positions vis-a-vis the environment, right? So he's just not capable of seeing that as a human necessity. Instead, he thinks of it as his exceptional position that he himself can alter without changing anything else. So the two fools we encounter in Malvolio and Feste differ specifically because of their levels of isolationism and inclusivity, right? While Feste is what we might call the all-inclusive fool, and literally including everybody in his parade of fools, in which he himself is one of them. Malvolio is the isolated fool, the fool who sees nothing but himself and therefore sees nothing but darkness. And we'll get to that in as we talk about the end of the play, right? I don't want to talk more about Feste and Malvolio at this point. I will ask a question of you in the discussion thread, which I would expect you to address. But do think of the solipsism and isolationism on the one hand that leads to a bitter fool, and to the communal, harmonious inclusivity of Feste's foolishness that leads to a sort of replenishable foolish wit, right? A replenishable fool, right? So that's what I think is the big difference between these two characters. All right, moving on, I will talk about how the play ends, about matrimony. I'll also talk about the prank a little bit, right? The prank that's pulled on Malvolio, and then the pranks that kind of settle as marriage at the end of the play. All right. I'll be back in just a few.